August 14th, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. A boy pressed his face against the chain-link fence, watching a man fold paper in the shadow of a guard tower. The man's hands moved with impossible precision, each crease sharp, each angle exact. The paper transformed. A square became a bird, wings spread, neck curved, suspended in midair before it rested on a wooden crate between them. The boy had never seen anything like it. His father, a sergeant who worked the perimeter, said nothing. They walked back toward the gate. The crane remained on the crate, drying in the August heat. Before we go further, if you're finding this story as powerful as we do, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another untold chapter from history. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from you, and your support keeps these stories alive. But here's what no one explained at the time. Why a man trained to die for his emperor would spend his afternoons folding paper birds for the children of his captors. Why guards allowed it. Why mothers brought their sons and daughters to the fence every Saturday. And why, decades later, those cranes would be found in attics and basements across Wisconsin, preserved like relics of something no one could quite name. The boy would carry that image for the rest of his life, and in the years to come he would realize that what he witnessed wasn't kindness. It was defiance, not against America, against forgetting. Camp McCoy stretched across 60,000 acres of central Wisconsin, surrounded by pine forests and farmland that turned white and silent every winter. It was one of over 500 prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States during the Second World War. Most Americans never knew they existed. Between 1943 and 1946, nearly 425,000 prisoners, German, Italian, and Japanese, lived and worked on American soil. The numbers were staggering. Germany alone sent more prisoners than the U.S. military could process, so the camps grew. They appeared in Kansas, Montana, Louisiana, Texas, Wisconsin, anywhere land was cheap and labor was needed. The Geneva Convention required captors to treat POWs humanely. It also required them to pay prisoners for work. 80 cents a day, enough to buy cigarettes, soap, or paper. Japanese prisoners were different. There were fewer of them, just over 5,000 by war's end. Most had been captured in the Aleutian Islands or isolated Pacific atolls. Unlike German POWs, who mixed with locals and sometimes blended in, Japanese prisoners lived under tighter restrictions. The public feared them more. Propaganda had done its work. Newspaper cartoons depicted them as monsters. Radio broadcasts called them subhuman. And yet they were here, behind wire, folding paper. At Camp McCoy, roughly 3,000 Japanese prisoners lived under guard. Most were soldiers. A few were fishermen or laborers swept up after Pearl Harbor. All were presumed dangerous. They were not allowed outside the wire without escort. They did not work in town. They did not speak to civilians unless ordered to. But children do not always follow rules. The boy came back the next week with 2 friends. They stood near the fence again, just beyond the warning line. The man was there. He was folding again. This time he held up the crane so they could see it clearly. One of the boys waved. The man nodded. A guard watched from 10 yards away. He said nothing. The boys left. The crane remained on the crate, drying in the sun. Inside the camp, hierarchy was everything. Prisoners organized themselves by rank, unit, and ideology. Officers commanded respect. Laborers deferred. Some men believed surrender was eternal shame. Others believed survival was the only duty left. Arguments flared in the barracks at night, whispered, bitter, unresolved. The man who folded cranes was named Hiroshi Tanaka. He had been a private in the Imperial Army, captured on Attu Island in May 1943. He was 27 years old. He did not speak much. Other prisoners called him quiet, not weak. There was a difference. He worked kitchen duty. He swept floors. He kept his bunk neat and his opinions private. But he folded paper whenever he could. Origami had been taught to him by his grandmother in Kyoto. She had learned it from her mother. The paper had to be square. The folds had to be sharp. There were no shortcuts. A crane took 64 steps if done correctly. Tanaka did not count anymore. His hands remembered. At first he folded for himself. It was something to do between meals and work shifts. It reminded him of home, not the war, not the ship that brought him here, but the house where he grew up, the smell of tatami mats, the sound of his grandmother's voice correcting his folds. Then the boys appeared. Tanaka did not plan it. He had been folding near the fence because the shade was better there. The boys watched. He finished the crane and left it on the crate. When he returned the next day, it was gone, so he folded another. This time the boys waited. Tanaka held it up. One boy pointed. Another smiled. Tanaka set the crane down and walked away. The next day the crane was gone again. The guard, a corporal named Dietrich, finally spoke. "They keep coming back," he said. Tanaka nodded. "You trying to make friends?" Tanaka shook his head. "They like the birds." Dietrich watched him for a long moment. Then he shrugged and walked his patrol. Word spread quietly. More children began showing up near the fence. Siblings, cousins, neighbor kids from Sparta and Tama. Most were the sons and daughters of soldiers, clerks or camp staff. They came on weekends, after school, sometimes in the evenings before supper. They did not shout or throw stones. They simply watched. Tanaka began folding different shapes: frogs, fish, butterflies, stars. Each one required precision, memory, and patience. He used paper scraps from supply crates, old newspapers, torn pages from discarded magazines. The shapes grew smaller as paper became scarce. Some cranes fit in the palm of a hand. The children began leaving things in return. A penny, a button, a piece of hard candy, a crayon drawing of a house. Tanaka collected them in a tin can under his bunk. He did not know what else to do with them. Other prisoners noticed. Some approved. Others did not. One night an officer confronted him in the barracks. "You are trading with the enemy's children," the officer said. Tanaka did not look up. "I am folding paper. You are embarrassing yourself and us. I have done nothing dishonorable." The officer's jaw tightened. "You are giving them souvenirs." Like a servant, Tanaka set down the crane he was working on. "I give them nothing but paper. They give me nothing but time." The officer said nothing more, but the tension remained. Captain Lawrence Oakes was the officer in charge of internal camp operations. He was 43 years old, a veteran of the First War, and deeply skeptical of sentiment. He had read the reports about fraternization. He knew the rules. POWs were not to be treated as guests, but they were also not to be abused. When Dietrich mentioned the paper cranes, Oakes decided to observe. He stood near the fence one Saturday afternoon and watched the exchange. A boy approached. Tanaka set down a folded frog. The boy picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and smiled. His mother, standing 20 feet back, waved politely. Tanaka bowed slightly and returned to the shade. Oakes walked over. "Private Tanaka," he said through the interpreter. "How long has this been happening?" Tanaka stood. 3 months, sir." "Do you charge them?" "No, sir." "Do they ask for specific shapes?" "Sometimes, sir." Oakes considered this. "And why do you do it?" Tanaka hesitated. Then he said, "Because I can." Oakes studied him for a long moment. "Carry on." He walked back toward the administration building. But the question stayed with him. Why would a man who had been trained to die for his emperor spend his afternoons folding toys for the children of his captors? There was no clear answer. And yet the cranes kept appearing, and the children kept coming. By early 1945, the trade had become routine. Tanaka folded every day. The children came regularly. Guards stopped questioning it. Even the camp commander, Colonel Theodore Fisher, had been briefed. He found it odd but harmless. The Red Cross had visited twice. No violations were noted. But something else was happening. The families who received the paper figures began talking about them. At church, at school, in the grocery store. The cranes and frogs became small symbols of something difficult to name. Not friendship, exactly, but recognition. The prisoners were still prisoners, but they were also men. One woman wrote a letter to her husband overseas. She described her son's collection of paper animals. "They're beautiful," she wrote. "I didn't expect that. I didn't expect them to be capable of beauty." Her husband never replied to that part of the letter. Other reactions were less generous. Some townspeople saw the trade as weakness. Why were children being allowed near enemy soldiers? Why were prisoners being given paper? Why weren't they punished more severely? A pastor in Sparta preached a sermon about forgiveness. He mentioned the cranes. Some congregants walked out. At the camp, the tension among prisoners intensified. A group of hardline soldiers confronted Tanaka again. They accused him of collaboration, of dishonoring the code, of making a spectacle. Tanaka did not argue. He simply continued folding. One night, someone tore up his paper stash. Tanaka cleaned it up without complaint. The next day, a guard named Sullivan brought him a stack of clean paper from the supply room. He set it down without a word and walked away. Tanaka bowed to his back. The war ended in August 1945. News of Hiroshima reached the camp 3 days after the bomb fell. The prisoners gathered in silence. Some wept, some turned their faces away. Tanaka sat alone in the shade and did not fold. For 2 weeks he stopped entirely. The children still came. They waited by the fence. No cranes appeared. One boy left a drawing of a bird. Tanaka found it later, tucked into the wire. He began folding again. This time the cranes were different. Smaller, sharper, more deliberate. He folded one for every person he remembered from home. His grandmother, his mother, his younger sister, his neighbor who played shamisen, his teacher who taught him calligraphy. He did not know if any of them were alive. The children did not understand. They simply took the cranes and carried them home. To them, the birds were still beautiful. To Tanaka, they were something else, something closer to prayer. Repatriation began in late 1945. Japanese prisoners were processed slowly, screened carefully, and sent back in waves. Tanaka was scheduled to leave in March 1946. He folded until the day before his departure. His final crane was left on the crate near the fence, weighted down with a small stone. A boy named Thomas found it the next morning. He kept it for 63 years. When he died in 2009, his daughter discovered it in a wooden box along with his father's dog tags and a photograph of Camp McCoy. She donated it to the Monroe County Historical Society. The crane is still there. Tanaka returned to Japan and found his city burned. His family was dead. He moved to Osaka and worked in a textile factory. He married late. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about the camp, he would only say, "I folded paper." He died in 1987. No one recorded his full story until a researcher found his name in camp rosters 40 years later. By then, most of the guards were dead. Most of the children were old. The camp itself had been dismantled in 1948, but the cranes remained, in basements, in attics, in boxes marked Dad's things or Grandpa's stuff. Some were damaged. Some were pristine. All were folded with the same 64 steps, the same sharp creases, the same impossible care. Years later, a journalist asked Captain Oakes, then retired and in his 80s, what he thought the cranes meant. Oakes paused. "I don't think they meant anything," he said. "I think they were just what he had left to give." But the journalist pressed. Didn't the cranes change how people saw the prisoners? Oakes shook his head slowly. "Maybe for a moment," he said. "But people forget, or they decide it didn't matter. The cranes were beautiful. That doesn't mean anyone learned anything from them." He was right. By the 1950s, most Americans had forgotten the camps existed. The prisoners had become footnotes, dusty mentions in history books. The cranes, meanwhile, became curiosities. An odd little story some remembered. Most did not. Children who had received them grew up and rarely spoke of the man who had folded them. Not out of shame exactly. It was subtler than that. An awkwardness, a quiet confusion. How could they cherish a gift from someone they had been taught to hate? How could a paper bird flutter above the barbed wire and the shouting, above the fear and humiliation, and seem for a moment more real than all of it? They carried the memory, but carried it lightly, as though it could be brushed aside like dust on a bookshelf. And Tanaka he folded until his hands could no longer remember the steps. In the evenings he would sit at the small kitchen table, the light from a single bulb casting long shadows across the walls. His fingers trembled, his joints stiffened. But he pressed on, and then one day they stopped altogether. His wife found scraps of paper tucked into books, between the folds of drawers, inside coat pockets, half-formed cranes that he could no longer finish. Their edges curled and frayed over the years, as if mourning the hands that once made them. She burned them after he died. She thought it was what he would have wanted, though she never said the thought aloud. The smoke rose in lazy spirals, carrying away pieces of a history that no one else seemed to remember. The boy who once held one of Tanaka's paper cranes grew into a man. The memory stayed only in fragments, like a photograph faded by sun. He became a teacher. He never spoke of the camp or of the faces pressed to wire, the whispered fear, or the quiet resilience of a man folding paper beneath cruelty. For 30 years he kept one crane in his desk drawer, yellowed, fragile, a talisman. On the day he retired, he threw it away, unsure why. Perhaps because it held a contradiction he never learned to carry, that beauty and cruelty had shared the same fence, the same dust, the same afternoon. The cranes did not stop the war. They did not erase camps, bombs, or deaths. They did not prove that kindness triumphs. They proved only that kindness exists small, stubborn, inexplicable. That even in a world built to crush, a man can fold paper and offer it across a divide, and it will matter, if only briefly. Tanaka never explained it. Words are brittle. Paper is forgiving. So he folded again and again, leaving fragile wings behind. Evidence of caring when caring was dangerous. The children grew up. History moved on. But the memory lingered in a pause, in a crease, in the thought that the world might have been otherwise. Kindness did not change history, but it existed. And sometimes that is enough.